Hello once again, fellow Unity developers, and welcome back to episode 5 of making a 2D bullet hell game. So, in the last tutorial, we set up some inheritance to make our lives easier down the line. So today, we're going to finally implement the cooldowns for shooting, and we're going to add some variance to our enemy and to our player. So let's move on to cooldowns. Currently, we're shooting once per frame. So you can imagine if we're running this game at 120 frames per second, we're going to be shooting bullets at 120 per second. So let's make a few changes. Let's go into our bullet hell car script and let's set a few of these variables that we created in the last episode. So let's set the health to be 100. We'll set the cooldown to be 1. We'll set the time last shot to be 0. And while we're here, let's set the acceleration to be 15. So what this means is both the player and the enemy are going to set with these variables. That's okay for now. So let's go back into bullet hell player and let's actually implement this cooldown. And it's actually pretty easy to do. So all we really need to do is we go if time.time is greater than time last shot plus shoot cooldown. And only in that case will we actually fire our bullet. And then we just need to set our time last shot to be equal to the current time. So this might be a bit confusing if you've never seen it before, so we can simplify this. So time.time is simply the current time in the game. Time last shot plus shoot cooldown is the next time that will be available to shoot at. So while the current time is less than that, we will not shoot. So that's the cooldown pretty much done for the player. So I'm just going to copy this whole function here and we'll go into our enemy and let's paste it in. So there are a few things we're going to want to change here because we're not actually shooting at the mouse position anymore. What we're going to want to do here is to shoot at the player. So how can we do this? We can go game object.find object with tag player. So what this is going to do is this is going to look for an object that has a player tag, and then we can get his game object.transform.position. So that's our 2. So now we're going to be shooting bullets from our enemy's position to the player's position. Also while we're here, if you remember correctly, our projectile prefab is set by default to be layer 9, which our game thinks is shot by the player. So if we were to run this game right now, the enemy would actually destroy itself because it's being triggered by a player bullet. And we can actually change layers through code, so let's do that now. So we can go projectile.layer equals 11. And this is going to set our projectile to be on the enemy projectiles layer. Also while we're here, let's make an override function for take input. So we'll go protected override void take input. And we'll put our shoot function inside it. And we'll just delete this update function since this will prevent the update function in our bullet hell car from running. Okay, perfect. So before this is going to actually work, we're going to want to make a few changes in our scene. So since we used find object with tag to find our player, we actually need to go into our player game object here and set our tag to player. And also on our enemy, we haven't assigned our projectile and rigid body, so let's change that now. We'll go into prefabs, drag our projectile prefab onto the enemy, and also give him a reference to his rigid body. Also, let's change the enemy's layer to be enemy instead of player. And we'll click yes and change children. So let's take a look and see what happens. So now, the enemy is going to shoot at us every 1 second, and when the player holds down the left mouse button, he'll also be shooting every 1 second. One thing you'll notice is that the projectiles just pass right through the player. So let's fix that. We'll go back into our bullet hell player script. And just like in our enemy script, we have an onTrigger enter, which checks for layer 9. And if he detects layer 9, we'll do damage. We want to do the same in the player. So we'll go else if collision.gameObject.layer equals 11. This means that we're intercepting a enemy bullet. So what we'll do is we'll take damage 100, and we'll also want to destroy the projectile. So we'll go collision.gameObject and wrap that in a destroy. Perfect. So now our player is going to get destroyed. However, there are still a few changes that we need to make. So our player and enemy have the same speeds, damage, and cooldown. We're not actually setting the damage on our projectiles, and for both the enemy and the player, we've got our hard-coded incoming damage to be 100. So let's address all of these issues. So to start, we'll need to go into bullet hell car, and we'll need to clear out all of these variables here. And you'll see why in a bit. Also, we'll want to add a projectile damage variable, so we'll go protected float projectile damage, and we want a projectile speed variable, so we'll go protected float projectile speed. And these are pretty self-explanatory. Now what we can do is we can set these variables inside the start methods of our enemy and our player. So let's start with our enemy, and we'll want to set his variables like this. Let's set acceleration to be 5. We'll set shoot cooldown to be 2. We'll set projectile damage to be 10. We'll set projectile speed to be 15. And we'll set his health to be 50. Now, we have set our projectile damage and speed, but we're not actually doing anything for the bullet. So let's change that. What we can do is we can get a reference to the projectile script on the bullet that we just created. So how do we do this? We can go projectile p equals projectile get component projectile. So what this is going to do is on the object that we just instantiated, we're going to get the projectile script on that game object, and then we can actually edit the values on that. So we can do p.damage equals projectile damage, and we can do p.speed equals projectile speed. So we'll also want to do the same for the player. So let's just copy this here while we're here, and let's go into our bullet hell player. So like the enemy, we'll also want to set variables in the start. So let's go acceleration equals new vector 2 14 15. We'll go shoot cooldown equals 0.1f. We'll go projectile damage equals 10. Projectile speed equals 20. And health equals 100. And let's go down into our shoot function. And let's paste. So now we're actually going to be setting projectile damage and speed on our player also. So now that we've hooked up outgoing bullets to be set with damage, we're going to need to make one last code change. So in our on-trigger enter 2D, we still have these hard-coded values of 100 for both the player and the enemy. So what we can do is we can actually get the projectile script off this collision. So if you go collision.get component projectile .damage, now we'll actually be taking the correct damage from the bullet that we just took. So let's copy this from our player. Let's go into our enemy and let's paste it over this 100. So if we run the game now, we have it so both the player and the enemy's bullets and incoming damage reflects the changes that we just made. Perfect. So there's just one final note that I'd like to make about layers in physics. So in a previous video, I mentioned that we can look at layers just like tags, and this is true, but there's a lot more that we can do with layers. With layers, we can actually choose which layers collide with which layers. So I'll show you what I mean. Let's go back into our bullet hell player script, and we'll go into this on-trigger enter 2D function. So inside here, I'm going to put a breakpoint on this opening bracket of our on-trigger enter 2D, I'm going to attach this debugger to Unity, and then I'm going to run Unity. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to launch the game, and as soon as the game starts, I'm going to shoot a bullet. So what's happening here? Even though the player's bullet will never ever be able to hit him, it's still a trigger, and it still goes into his onTriggerEnter function. And it's going to see if it matches these two if statements, which it will never do. So this is a waste, and we can actually change this. So let's close our debugger, and let's change some physics settings. So how do we do this? We'll go into Edit, Project Settings, Physics 2D. Now here, we actually have a matrix of all the layers that can collide with each other. This can be a bit confusing, but let's go with it for now. What we can do here is we can disable collisions between the player and the player projectile. So this is this one here. And we can change collisions between the enemy and the enemy projectile. This one here. So now if we were to run that little demo again, the code on the onTrigger function would never be called. Perfect. So in this episode, we learned how to implement cooldowns and damage. We added some variance between the player and the enemy, and we also disabled collisions between layers that should never be able to collide. In the next episode, we'll be doing some more work on the enemy's AI. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.